Thinking about this episode after many years on considering of doing the review out of it, it's really difficult to look at this episode as good when you take into consideration if you only look at this episode as its own thing and ignore everything that happens after the episode. Granted, what happens before the episode may have build up to this, but judging of how the episode ends with the characters obviously not learning anything of what they went through on the island, it's one thing to be the only two humans on the island with no one to judge you, but at the same time, when your friends figure out how redundant it is to see you and your friend, which is not really your friend, argue all the time in order to continue on the rivalry that has been going on since the very beginning. Regardless if Libby, Sheen, and Kara are mostly okay with Jimmy and Cindy arguing back in Retroville, but at the same time, this episode also aged awkwardly, mainly the fact that it didn't turn out to be better than I thought, but that's mainly my own point of view of the episode. So if it wasn't obvious enough when it comes to this plot, the episode begins with Jimmy and Cindy arguing on who is right when it comes to the location that they're talking about, and then when Jimmy takes Cindy and his friends to the location to prove that he is right, they get into a situation where they get off of the hover car accidentally, which leads to Jimmy and Cindy on an abandoned island. And since that the island is completely dangerous, they have no other choice but to work together in order to save themselves. And with the less arguing they have against each other, the more closer they get. This episode doesn't include them kissing, but at the same time, it did showcase the moments of them getting closer to each other rather than arguing. To tell you the truth, I have mixed opinions on this episode on whether if it's good or bad, but at the same time, it's neither of those things to the point that it's difficult to consider this episode mediocre, but it's also difficult to consider this episode as one of the best episodes from the show, or even from season 3. Whenever my Jimmy Neutron vibe comes back, whenever I rewatch these episodes, all I can think of is that this episode is really difficult to consider on making sense when it comes to Jimmy Neutron and Cindy Vortex's chemistry, because it kinda does when it comes to the past episodes, but with them reverting back to how they were as if nothing happened, even though they did remember their experiences on the island, kind of makes this episode a difficult episode to consider good. Now, the meaning of Jimmy and Cindy getting stranded on the island without anything else to do, because it could be the end of their lives when it comes to the old social lives outside of the island, where they have to reform new lives on the island. Honestly, it's relatable. Like, you don't get too much stress, and the only thing you have to worry about is mainly the danger parts of the island, which, for one thing, you can really admire the execution of what the writers are trying to do when it comes to the scenario that Jimmy and Cindy are in, which does work out, but taking into consideration that with them being the only humans on the island, honestly, if this episode was a 44-minute special, they would have explored the chemistry a lot more, and when they leave the island, they would come to the realization that they should revert back into the old arguments like before. I'm just saying, what happens off-screen in this episode really damages the credibility of what this episode is accomplishing when it comes to Jimmy and Cindy being stranded while their friends are trying to search for them. Speaking of which, the subplot centering around Sheen, Carla, and Libby is the biggest highlight of the entire episode. If it wasn't for the fact that the main plot ends up going flip-floppy due to the execution of the off-screen situation involving Jimmy and Cindy once they leave the island. If this episode were 44 minutes, then I'm pretty sure that this subplot will have dragged out way too long, because every single scene involving these three characters is what makes this subplot worthwhile. They are trying to operate Jimmy's hover car, and with them getting into shenanigans, since that they're in the middle of the ocean, honestly, they're in more of a situation than Jimmy and Cindy, to be honest. My favorite moment is, well, when they try to find some help from people in the ocean, which is impossible. They see a cruise ship filled with people, and they need to find a way to get their attention. And then when they see the emergency button, Sheen pressed it, and apparently it was a torpedo launching towards the cruise ship, and somehow the citizens there survive, and Libby says, "Let's keep this to ourselves." That is honestly the best joke in this entire season, and it may be debatable if it's the funniest scene in this entire series, but you really have to admit that the fact that Jimmy and Cindy didn't realize this, I'm pretty sure that they will probably be more in a pickle if the tank running out of gas would probably put Jimmy and Cindy into a more panicked state and more frustrated state. Granted, it would have probably made the subplot less funny, but at the same time, it's just me thinking of what the alternative would have looked like. So getting back to Jimmy and Cindy, I really want to be convinced that with them being stranded on an island would improve their chemistry, that would have made it less toxic. But at the same time, considering that this show is the least episodic, and what I mean least episodic is the fact that it takes character arcs and story arcs seriously than other Nicktoons. It's also where they handle the character and story arcs the least. The scene where the giant spider is about to destroy the hover car because the characters put its eggs in the gas tank. Cindy actually said Jimmy's name, which surprised Jimmy in the middle of the episode. So when she says it in front of Sheen, Libby, and Carla, the reaction went from getting stranded on the island forever completely shifts to them saying, "Did you just call him Jimmy?" Honestly, this is supposed to be a really humorous moment, which I will admit it really got a chuckle out of me upon rewatching this episode time after time. But thinking critically about this episode when it comes to Cindy's character, even though that she is the least mean-spirited in this, despite the arguments that she did towards Jimmy in the beginning before they worked together, it really gave me the impression that she really wants to stay on the island in order to be a better person, but at the same time, when she goes back to her social life, her being a better person is just literally out of the question. I mean, if I really considered on taking Cindy's life seriously, I will probably do the same involving the other characters, considering that Carla's life is a lot more complex due to his issues. Sheen's life is not really complex considering that he is so hyper about Ultralord, while Jimmy obviously is so into science to the point that his big brain really keeps him from being too afraid of what happens in the future, and when it comes to Libby, she's the most stable, even being friends with Cindy, but at the same time, considering that Nick had an issue when it comes to his popularity plummeting as we got to this season, honestly, I can't imagine what this show would have been like if Nick was one of the main characters in this instead of Libby, but I'm pretty sure that Libby's life wouldn't change if she wasn't the main character. I really wanted to say a lot about this episode, but if I do, I will have to talk about the other Jimmy and Cindy centered episodes, including the ones that I've already talked about on this channel, even if they were mostly briefly when it comes to the wedding episode and the Crouching Jimmy Hidden Sheen episode that I reviewed nearly a year ago. That would have been part of Valentine's Half Month 6 if I did that schedule last year. The thing is that this episode has been on my mind to the point that it's difficult to look at the chemistry involving Jimmy and Cindy as a good thing, but at the same time, that doesn't automatically mean that this episode is one of the best from this show. You can say it's somewhat underrated, but at the same time, it can also be overrated. The ending of this episode really showcases onto why this episode isn't one of my favorites, and with the other Season 3 episode involving Jimmy and Cindy, King of Mars, I am considering on reviewing that episode in the future, but at the same time, despite Cindy being in the white while Jimmy being in the one, it just continues of them not learning anything of what they went through in this episode when they got stranded. I'm just saying, I'm considering on reviewing the episode when I get the chance, but at the same time, my point of view of that episode will be similar to my point of view of this episode. If we did live in an alternative universe where the Ant Bully never got flopped in the box office and we did get Season 4 of Jimmy Neutron, let's be real, it's gonna be difficult to see Jimmy and Cindy together even if it's a good thing for the shippers, because even though that there are some ships that I do wish were more developed a lot more, I'm not a ship of Jimmy and Cindy, and I don't even think I would be able to enjoy these two together because I don't have a love and hate relationship of this in comparison to Jimmy and Cindy's love-hate relationship with each other. Let's be perfectly real. If I do have that, then I will have shipped these characters a long time ago. I'm giving this episode a 6.5 out of 10.